Hello, this is the customization guide for the dynamic combat text asset. So I have here the map shooting gallery. If you go to the dynamic combat text asset, go to demo, go to map, you'll see this map here called map underscore shooting gallery, and that's what I have open right here. So out of the box, if you just run this project, you'll see that each of these shooting targets is going to demonstrate a different looking text. So if I shoot this one, this is called the normal text type. So if you have a combat game and you're just doing like regular damage, it could look something like this. You can always change it and edit it, but by default it looks something like this. If you shoot that one right there, that's like that could be like a critical hit. So you can see the animation looks quite different, whereas this one sort of pops out like in a parabolic arc. This one kind of almost appears like in a cluster. This one is it goes out from the center, but you can see that it kind of slows down as it sort of as it sort of expands out. So that looks a little bit different as well. And then you can see that you can put outlines and you can sort of make it pop. So that looks quite different as well. This one is set up to only go left and right. So you see that it sort of it never goes directly up and directly down. It's always sort of tending towards left and right. And you'll notice that it also has an icon, so you can add icons to your text as well. This one is doing like a really big pop and it goes straight up. And then this one here, it simulates like a combat system. So it's essentially doing all these ones that I've shown you before in random. So if you have a game where your weapon can do like fire damage and cold damage and critical hits, and enemies can parry and block, and you can add special effects like you can stun the enemy and silence the enemy. It could look something like this. So this is just an example setup. So if we go to the shooting target, which we started setting up in the last video, but this is the actual shooting target that comes with the asset. So if you open that, the first thing you notice is that there's quite a lot of blueprint logic. The first thing I should say is that a lot of this logic is really just for demonstration purposes, so don't worry that it's going to be confusing. It really isn't relevant for your project. It's just there for demonstration. So this entire chunk here, for example, is just simulating a combat system, right? So you can see that it does the enemy does will randomly negate some damage, and then it checks for critical hit, and then it applies random elemental damage and random status effects. So this is just set up to essentially demonstrate this shooting target. Okay, so your game is not going to be set up like this, so that's just for demonstration purposes. And then all this logic over here um, is just using a enum, and then depending on what the enum is, it's going to display a different type of text. So this essentially just controls, because all these shooting targets is using the same actor, this logic here determines which animation and which text type that is using. So again, there's a little bit of logic here, but that's just for demonstration purposes. And then finally, you might see a couple of things that you might not really understand what they are if you've never worked in multiplayer games. So switch has authority, and also some of these functions are set to multicast. That's just because this project out of the box is multiplayer compatible. If you don't need multiplayer, then you can just delete this node here, and any function that is multicast, you can just set it back to not replicated. That's if you do sort of use this as an example for your projects. Obviously, if you set up your own functions, then you won't really need to worry about how this example differs. So I think the first thing that I should probably go through are the concept of text types. So if we go to the function where we actually activate the combat text, which is here, right? So I've got a function here, and depending on on what the text type we want, it's going to call activate text on the combat text. So some of them are going to have override, some of them is just straight up calling the activate text given the text type. So we saw in the last video that in this drop down here, we've got a bunch of text types. So we've got normal, critical, status effect, and so on. This list is populated by this enumeration. So if we go to, so not in that, so let's exit the demo folder. If we go to the blueprints folder, there is an enumeration called text types. So if you open that, you'll see a bunch of entries here: normal, critical, status effects, etc., play damage taken. And if we go back to our drop-down list box, you'll see that these are the entries that populate this here, right? So, and then each of these entries need to be set up to animate in a certain way. And has a bunch of properties to determine how it looks on screen. So if we open the blueprint BP combat text, so that's in the blueprints folder. If you open that, and this is really the blueprint where most of the logic happens. So if you open that and you go down here and you see this text type variable, if you open the array, you're going to see a bunch of entries. And if you open each one of these, you see that this is the text type identifier for normal. And these are all the settings that control how the normal text type looks. And then if you look at the next one, so you've got critical hit, status effect, and so on. So for each of these entries in the enumeration for text types, you want a corresponding entry in this array. And when you set the identifier, then everything that comes after that is the options and the customizations that's going to be associated with the identifier, right? So let's just, so for example, let's just go back to this one. So this particular shooting target is set up to show the normal damage, right? That's the demonstration type. So if I run the game and I come over here and I shoot this target, that's using the normal text type. So if I go to the combat text blueprint and I go to the normal text type, and let's make this really obvious. So the text, the number size is 20. Let's make that like 60. So if I compile that, so now the normal text type is going to have size 60 text. Okay. So you can change any of these properties and that will change how normal looks every time you call the combat text to activate, right? So anytime you're going to call activate text and you choose the normal text type, how it looks is defined by all these properties over here, okay? So let's set that number size back to 20. So you can add like new text types if you need them, or you can modify all the ones that are here. So I think what we're going to do is let's add a new one and we can sort of go through some of the customization options and see what they actually do. So if I go to the enum text types and I'm going to add a new entry, and I'm just going to call this let's call this test. Let's just call it test. That's a bit boring, but I think that's makes it obvious what we're trying to do. So text, let's call it test type. No, that's too similar to text type. Let's just leave it at let's just leave it as test. It doesn't really matter. So save that enumeration, and then so as soon as you add it and you save it, and then you go to the drop down, it's going to appear there, right? So now we've got the test, which we can set. So for example, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just modify this blueprint. So this is all the logic that comes out of the box, which is set up to demonstrate all the different text types. But for this demonstration, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make it really simple. So you've already seen this in the previous tutorial. So on hit, I destroy the projectile. I store the impact point. And then I'm just going to disconnect this. and then I'm just going to add the activate text, right? So whenever the target is hit, it's going to destroy the projectile, store the impact point, and then we're just going to call activate text manually. So rather than using all the logic that we've got here, we're just going to activate the specific type of text that we want. So stored impact point, let's put that there. And damage, let's use like the last video, let's just use a random float. And let's set that to I don't know, 50 to 150. So let's set that to test. And then before we run this, what we have to do is in the text types variable, we have to add a new entry. All right. So these are all the ones that come out of that come with this package, and then we have to add a new one for the test type that we just added. So we just added a new entry. We open that, and let's set the text type identifier to test. Okay. Oops. Now just to make sure that it's using this one, let's just change this to a color that we're not currently using. Let's change that to like a kind of gold color. Okay. So the test type is using the gold text color. We compile that. So the shooting target that gets hit is going to display a text of test type. And it's going to spawn it at the hit location. And this is going to basically make all of these targets spawn the text type, right? Because we've disconnected all the logic. We've disconnected all this that displays a different text depending on this variable. So we've just unhooked all that, and every one of these now is just going to display test. Okay. So that's using our new test type. Now let's look at all of the different customization options. So if we open this, you'll see that it's got a whole bunch of things that you can change. And every time that you're going to call activate text and use the test type, it's going to use these options. So the animation type, there's a whole bunch of different ones there. So you can go linear up, linear down, left, right, etc. Left, right only. And then you got parabolic, which means that the text kind of goes in one direction, then it sort of falls down towards the other. So let's change this text to another color. That gold was quite hard to see. Let's make it kind of like a light blue. So let's try parabolic down. I'm not going to go through all these. You can sort of go through these sort of on your own. So if we try the parabolic down, so you actually can't really see the animation because the lifetime is really short. So if we set the lifetime to a little bit higher, so let's set it to 1.3, then there should be enough time to see the text go in reverse. Okay, there you go. So that's the parabolic down. So it goes down and then it goes back up. So you can go parabolic right, which means the text will go right and then swing back left, and same for all the other directions. So there's a bunch of animation types. I won't go through all these. You can sort of go through these on your own. The spawn angle. This determines the possible angle range from 0 to 1 that the text can spawn from. So if I set this to linear up, which is probably the easiest way to demonstrate this. If I set that to 0, sorry, let me try a few more things. So the best way to, did I set the right one? I feel like I thought I set that to 0. Or maybe I set this to 0. Okay, so let's set that to 0. Let's set all these to 0 as well. Because the easiest way to show how some of these options work is to set everything to 0, so you can only see this particular property in effect. So if we set the spawn angle range to 0, then when sorry, Oh, I'm pretty sure I set a wrong text somewhere. Right, I set the normal text. I think that was 0.5. It doesn't really matter. Um, yeah, so make sure you're setting the right text type. So let's set that to linear up with a spawn angle range of 0. So you'll see that the text spawns, it only goes straight up because the angle range is 0. There's no variation. So if we set the spawn angle range to 1, which is the maximum value that you can set, you'll see that the number's going to spread out a lot more. So they're still going up because the animation type is set to linear up, so it'll never go down or left or right, but it's going to spread out in a much wider pattern. And if you set that to something like in between, like let's say 0.25 or something, then it's going to be a lot narrower, but not straight up. So you can sort of set that value between 0 and 1. And then we have the random spawn offset. So by default, if it's set to 0, 0, then the text is always going to spawn from the exact same position. You see that it pretty much spawns at the hit location. If you set these values up to say like 50-50, essentially it's going to spawn the text in a random location within like a 50 unit radius. So if we run the game now, you see that it's going to spawn that text in a random location from the impact point. So obviously if we set that to something like really high, like 200, then the randomness is going to be much greater. Okay. So let's set that back to let's set everything to 0 again, just so that we can get a much clearer idea of what these other options do. So directional spawn offset, that is going to apply an offset to the text in the direction that that is told to go in, if that makes any sense. So linear up, if I set that to say like 100, then it's going to spawn the text at 100 units like above, right? That's because this is using linear up. If I set the animation to say linear left, then it's going to offset that text 100 units to the left. Okay. For example, if I choose linear random, which means they can go in any direction, then it's going to offset that text 100 units from the point of impact. See how that works? So, in a lot of games that I've seen, they generally offset it a little bit just so that the point of impact isn't obscured. So generally, like, if you're kind of shooting an enemy or if you're hitting an enemy, you kind of want to see the point of impact because you want to see like blood spatter, you want to see like really cool effects. So generally they do kind of offset the text so it doesn't obscure that hit. At least that's from what I've seen. So so you can use that offset for that purpose. So let's set that back to 0. So pop size, if we set that to like large, this should be quite obvious what it does. The text will just pop up much larger. So you have none, small, and medium. I think by default it's set to small. Come to stop means that just before the text starts to fade, the text will actually stop moving. So you can sort of see it moves out and then it stops, and then it fades out. So rather than continuing forever until it fades out, it comes to a stop. And then we have deceleration. So if we disable that, deceleration. So deceleration is similar to come to stop, but it kind of slows down and it never quite stops. So if we set that to say 1.5, I don't know whether that's enough to see the effect, but let's give that a go. You'll see that when the text comes out, it slows down, right? It doesn't ever come to a complete stop, but it slows down. And again, I've seen a lot of games do this. That's why I added this option. So that's so let's set that back to 0. Lifetime, that's pretty self-explanatory. The longer the bigger this number is, let's set it to 5 seconds. It's going to be on screen for 5 seconds, which might even go off the screen. Yeah, okay. So that's lifetimes, and then the speed. I won't bother showing that. The higher you set that value, the faster the numbers are going to travel. So show number. If you so there are times when you might not want to show a number. So in the example that I've sort of shown before, you can shoot a target. It might display like a word, like block or parry or stun. In those situations, you don't want to show a number, so you can just untick that. But then you'll obviously have to add an optional message. So if you set show number to false and you don't have a message, then it's not going to display anything. Okay. So if you're not going to show a number, let's add some text. Let's it's, I don't know, burn or something. I'm not sure. Then you can have like just text with no numbers. You can have both. So you can have number and text, and you can set the size of both differently, right? So let's so if we have text and number, so you can see that the text is underneath the number, and then you can change the sizes differently. So let's say the number is 18 font, sorry, 18 text size, and then the message is 10, and then you can get something like that. The colors, we've already seen that, so you can change the colors of the text. You can change the font. So the package only comes with Roboto because that's the engine font. But obviously you can sort of add your own fonts, and you can sort of change it for each text type. The outline size. Sorry, I think there was one more thing. The font typeface. Okay, so you can set this to, so if your font does have different types of typefaces, you can add them here. So if I change that to, so let's just show you how it works by default. So it looks like that. So this is just the default font face. If we set that to bold, for example, which is one of the typefaces for Roboto, then the text is bold. And then you can change things like the outline size. So by default, it's got no outline. So again, if we run that, you'll see that there's no outline for the text. You can set the outline to, let's set it to 2. By default, it's black. Let's change it to like a dark blue, and you're gonna get something like that. So it looks a little bit cartoony. Looks quite cool. You can set that to like a much larger value, and then it looks really cartoony. So let's set that to like 5. Get something like that. So let's set outline says, let's set that back to 1, and then you can sort of you can also change the shadow offset. So by default it's set to 2. You can change it to say 5. You can change the color to something else, and then the shadow is going to look different. Okay, so these are all the settings. So depending on what you set here, you can actually, sorry, there's one more, I forgot about that, the optional icon. So by default it's set to none, but then if you add an icon, let's say we add cold, I think it's called, oh, freeze, nope, ice. Trying to remember what I call my own assets. So if we set the ice icon, then it's also going to display an icon to the left of the text. Get like a snowflake icon, and then you can also scale the icon. So set it to 3. You're going to get a massive snowflake. There you go. So, hopefully you can sort of see that depending on how you set all these options, you can get text to look very different. So you can, a combination of the animation type, the font, the text outline options, the directional spawn offsets and random offsets, the speeds and lifetimes, come to stop, all these options, you can get the text to look really, really different. So if I just quickly connect back the logic, I can just again show you how some of these animations have been set up. So if I set that back to randomized damage and just ignore this test for now. So this is using, okay, so I did change that. Let's set that back to parabolic up, because that's what it was before I changed it. So that's using parabolic up. That is using a that's using like a random offset, a large random offset, and then a very, very low speed, right? And it's using like, I'm pretty sure this one's using like random linear, so it can go in any direction, but the speed is very, very slow. So it gives you this effect of popping up and then not moving very much and then sort of disappearing. This one is using the deceleration. So this is using linear random direction with a small offset. So you can see that the text doesn't spawn right from the middle. There's a small offset and then it comes to a stop. This one is using cardinal direction, which means it can only spawn left, right, up, and down. It's kind of hard. It's kind of difficult to tell exactly what it's doing. And then it's using, I believe, the come to stop animation type. So it sort of pops out and then it stops and then it disappears. And it's using like quite a thick outline, and I've customized the color for the outline for each of these status effects. This one is using the left-right animation. So there's an animation that will spawn the text and get it to move only in the left-right directions, which this one is using. And I'm obviously using icons for this one as well, and I'm also using both the text and the number. Oh, this one is using linear up, and it's using just the text only, and it's using I believe this one's using the medium size pop. So it's not the largest one, but it's using the medium one. So this one pops a lot more than the other one. So all these other ones, it's using small pop. It's kind of subtle, but it does sort of pop when the text is activated. But this one's using a much larger pop. And then this one is basically randomly doing all of them. Okay, so that's it for the customization option. So again, to recap, if you want to add a new text type, you just have to add a new entry to the enumeration text types. Okay, and that will automatically fill the drop down anytime you call activate text. And then you have to go into combat text, add a new entry here, set the identifier to the type that you just added, and then you can customize how it looks. And every time you call the text activate with this identifier, it's going to use these options here. So there's a few more options that I want to go through. So if you go to BP combat text, this blueprint, there's a few more things here. The num widgets per actor is, so by default, the object which spawns the BP combat text. So if you remember in our last video, this is how you set up the combat text. So for any actor that's going to display combat text, like an enemy or a crate, this is how you set it up. You spawn a new combat text, you store it, and then you initialize it, right? And what the combat text does is that when this combat text is created, it will create a bunch of widgets. So it uses something called pooling. So instead of creating a new widget dynamically every time, it creates a bunch of them at the start, and then it reuses them. So this just prevents the CPU from activating the. Sorry, this prevents UE4 from essentially, calling the garbage collector, which can get the CPU to stutter if you're sort of calling things to create and destroy all the time. So this just sort of it's just a way to minimize that, especially because you're probably going to get a lot of damaged text on screen at the same time. So what this value is essentially how many widgets do you want the combat text to create on start. So you kind of want this to be a number that is close to or slightly above the maximum number of the maximum the maximum number of text that you think this object is ever going to display on screen at once. So if you have like a really fast paced action game, you probably want to set this to be a little bit higher. If it's a very slow game, then you can set this to be a little bit lower. Essentially, once it reaches 15 and you want to display another combat text, but there's already 15 text on screen already for this particular actor, then it's not going to display anymore because it has to wait for them to finish to recycle them. So if you are finding that it's not displaying text as you need them, you might want to increase this number. 15 is quite a lot. But you can always sort of set that to whatever you need. So decimal precision is set to 0, so you can set that to 2, and then when you display text, it will display numbers up to 2 decimal precisions. And then attached to actor, by default this is set to false. So what this means is, it's probably easier if I just show you. So if I shoot a moving target, and remember this is set to not attached to actor, you see that the text spawns. It does spawn at the hit location, but then it kind of continues animating from the position that it spawned from. Whereas if I let's set position back to 0. Whereas if I set that to true, you'll see that the text kind of it's attached to the actor. It kind of moves with the actor, right? Most games that I've seen is not attached. That's why by default that's set to false. And then finally, the scaling distances. So this controls at what distances the widget is going to start scaling down, and the minimum scale the widget will be at the maximum distance that you define. So essentially, what this means is the start scaling distance is that it won't start scaling down until it's beyond this distance, right? From the player. So anything below 10 meters, it's going to be at maximum size. And then anything from 10 meters to 25 meters, the max scale distance, it's going to start scaling down. And then at 25 meters and beyond, it's going to be at 0.5 distance. So if we give that a run, so if I go to this corner, those targets in that corner are at 27 meters, so they are at the maximum distance. So you'll see that the pop-up text is a little bit smaller compared to, so if I go right up close, so that's at maximum size. It's probably easy if I actually change that to a really low number. So let's say at maximum distance, it's going to be 0.2. That should be very obvious. So again, at that's the maximum size. And then if I go right into this corner and shoot that, it's going to be at 0.2 size. And if I keep going back and even further out and I shoot it, it's always going to be that size. It can't scale smaller than 0.2, right? If you don't want scaling ever, then you can obviously just set the widget scale at max distance to 1. Then that means that even at max distance, it's going to be 1. Okay, so by default that's set to 0.5, which I think looks pretty good for like an FPS game. Set that back to 0.5. So that's pretty much for all the options. I encourage you to look at the demo map. I encourage you to look at the shooting target and sort of try and follow the logic, and then yeah, like have a look at have a look at how some of the default text types are set up, like the normal and the critical. Um, yeah, sorry, there is one more thing that I want to go through before I forget. Is um, so I mentioned in the last video that you can use the override. Sorry, you can use the activate text with overrides function to override certain properties. So I mentioned last time that if you have status effects like slow, stun, um, confuse, silence, whatever, what you could do obviously is you could go into enum text types and you can add those individually. So you can add stun, you know, freeze, slow, or whatever, um, and then you can add an entry for each one here, right? You can do that and you can set them up individually to determine how they look. But let's say they kind of all look similar. Let's say like anytime you do a status effect, it's going to use like parabolic left, for example. It's always going to use pop size medium. It's always going to have like a directional offset of 35. But the actual text and the colors are going to change. So what you can do is you can, instead of like creating them individually, you can create like something called status effect, right? And you can set up how status effects are going to look. So if all your status effects are going to look very similar, then you can set up like a status effect text type, um, and then when you call activate text, you can call it with overrides to change how it looks. So if we go to shooting target, if we go to this function here, you'll see that for the status effects like stun, slow, silence, and confuse, the ones that I've sort of set up in this demonstration, you'll see that I'm using status effect text type every time, right? So status effect, status effect, status effects, and status effect. But then I'm overriding the text, I'm overriding the color, and I'm overriding the outline color, right? So this allows me to use all the settings for status effect, like deceleration, lifetime, animation type, and all that. But then I can override certain properties. So then that allows me to not have to create like text types for every single status effect. So it's up to you. You can if you want. If each one needs to look like a little bit different, but if you have text types that are kind of grouped in categories and they kind of look the same, but you just want to change the word or the color, then it's probably best to kind of like create a text type, kind of almost like a group name, and then you can override certain properties. So that's pretty much it for customization options. Um, uh, if there's anything that you are confused about or you want more sort of help, you can always post a comment here, and I'll I'll look at it and I can respond. If you haven't seen the setup video, if you sort of skipped ahead, I'll encourage you to look at that as well. I'm going to add the link below. But otherwise, again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.